Hello and welcome to the WPAOG podcast. This episode features an interview with Dr. Chris Gibson, the president of Siena College. Gibson is a scholar of leadership and politics, a decorated combat veteran, and a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Upon becoming the 12th president of Siena College in early 2020, Gibson led the COVID task force during unprecedented times. He is the first permanent lay leader in Siena's history and serves on the faculty as a professor of leadership. Prior, Dr. Gibson served District 19 in New York in the U.S. House of Representatives for 3 terms from 2011 to 2017, and was ranked first among all House representatives in the inaugural report of the Lugar Policy Center Bipartisan Index in 2014. He is a 29-year decorated military veteran who rose to the rank of colonel in the U.S. Army. Gibson commanded the 82nd Airborne Division's 2nd Brigade in Haiti, served 4 combat tours in Iraq, was part of the NATO peacekeeping mission in Kosovo, and taught in the USMA Department of Social Sciences from 1995 to 1998. The USMA academic year of 2022 to 2023 is dedicated to the study of the military officer's role and relationship with society and our civilian leaders. Civil-military relations includes exploring the difference between partisan and political activity, what drives the public's confidence in the military, and how leadership adequately prepares cadets to steward the profession as company-grade officers and understand the roles and responsibilities of more senior officers. In this episode, Dr. Gibson talks about the current state of civil-military relations, the controversial use of social media as a means for free speech, and the future for military nonpartisan norms. Now, please enjoy this interview between Dr. Chris Gibson and your host, Colonel Heidi Demarest, class of 2001, acting head of the Department of Social Sciences.
President Gibson, thank you for talking about the state of civil-military relations today. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Our last conversation about this topic was a little over 2 months ago at West Point during a symposium on stewarding the profession. And as part of the dean's theme this year across the academic program, which is called to serve military leadership in a democratic republic, he, as you know, hosted several distinguished senior administration officials, former military leaders and practitioners, and some prominent scholars to talk very candidly about the challenges of civil-military relations today and into the future. And the symposium was really for the purpose of generating ideas for how West Point can better lead in inculcating norms of the profession in our cadets and even across the officer corps. And your comments during that symposium were extremely insightful, and we're hoping to cover some of that conversation today, along with addressing some contemporary examples. So we'll just jump right in, if you're ready. As you and certainly many others who are listening to this will know, civilian control of the military is one of those core constitutional concepts that cadets learn about extensively throughout their experience at West Point. But perhaps we could start at the very beginning and just set the stage by talking about why the framers were so intent on the construct that they eventually codified for control of the military in Philadelphia.
Yeah, well, putting ourselves back in that time period, 1786, 1787, many of the leaders of our country felt like we needed to address the liberty-security continuum. When you think about life under the Articles of Confederation, we had liberty. We also had chaos. We had Shays' Rebellion. We had, states that were coining money. States were potentially entering into treaty agreements with other nations. So there were many leaders in our country who thought we needed to adjust the liberty-security continuum more towards security, balancing liberty and security. And, they bring forward, for example, to help with security, a standing army. Something they were concerned about. They had seen abuses with standing armies. King George's most immediate was resonating in their memory. So they bring forward a standing army, and then, of course, under the bedrock of civilian control. But that construct that you're referring to really comes as a commentary to what the founders believed was human nature. Human nature, very complex. Humans are incredible. They can love, sacrifice, but also we have lesser angels. And so, I will describe this as a Madisonian construct, but it really is a comment about human nature, and it's a comment about power and how power should be arrayed. I just mentioned civilian control, but it's on every page, this construct. And so, you see we create separate branches of government, 3 of them. They're going to share power. They're going to juxtapose power. And this is really what Madison described as ambition to counteract ambition as an animating principle. So beyond the separation of powers and checks and balances, you also see the military. So we're part of this. So you'll see that the Congress, actually Article 1, Section 8, has the power to not only write the policies, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, but also to declare war. If we're going to go to war, it's going to come from the people's representatives. So you see Congress with significant powers with regard to the land forces, but yet we also see the executive is designated as the commander-in-chief. So these animating principles, this construct, is evident. I want to make one last point to this question, and that is that while civilian control of the military is clearly provided for, what was really on the founders' mind beyond that, they needed to provide for civilian control, was political control of the military, which really concerned them. I mentioned King George, but also they were concerned about a marauding congressional leader, Oliver Cromwell, for example. So, that's really what's driving a lot of this juxtaposition of power and really the sharing of responsibilities. And in the modern context, not only the executive and legislative branch, but also the judicial branch, which has developed over time, all 3 institutions involved in controlling the military. So that political control of the military, is also an underappreciated dimension of what happened at Philadelphia.
Thank you. So that's interesting that human nature might be consistent over time, but certainly this liberty security continuum you mentioned continues to evolve. And I think that relates really well to a point we discussed at the symposium this summer, which was the necessity, but also perhaps the potential inadequacy of those constitutional constructs for effective civil-military relations in the modern era. The framers would not have anticipated the advent of social media, for example. And I'm not blaming them. I'm not sure either of us could have predicted social media either. But in your estimation, and I know you've written extensively about this, where do you see the greatest fissures in the current state of civil-military relations?
Well, there actually are many, and they're at different levels. But I will say that on this issue area you're pointing to, you start to see this after the Second World War, because before that period, our standing military establishment was relatively small. And then after the Second World War, we really don't fully demobilize. And so we have a situation really for the first time in our country's history. We have this expanded presence, this military presence throughout the country and even overseas. And so we have scholars who write about this. We know we have constitutional stipulations, but it's becoming evident that norms are playing a big role in how civil-military relations will unfold. And of course, then we have General MacArthur, and he has big disagreements with the President of the United States, the duly elected leader. And so now it's right out there for everybody to see. And so we have scholars who come forward. And this is so for all the listeners out there, West Point graduates, you'll remember Samuel Huntington, Soldier in the State, classic, a great book. And he comes forward and he's describing, as you point out, that things have changed over time. This liberty security continuum. We have scholars writing about the concern of a garrison state and what is this going to mean for civil liberties. And Huntington really describes this dynamic, and he comes forward with a normative framework that he believes will best allow us to maximize liberty and security. He calls this objective control of the military. It's still taught to this day. This book is still highly significant. Even remember those days on the plane, they're still being taught. This book is still being taught at West Point now. And so objective control is essentially an arrangement where politicians agree to allow combat commanders to direct tactical operations. And then on matters of national security, even on policy, that's going to be left to the civilian masters. So this is an arrangement that the warrior is going to be pretty happy with, right? So politicians are going to stay out of me shaping the culture of the unit. And then when I conduct combat operations. I'm going to be the person doing that. That seems attractive, right? The issue is there really aren't separate spheres. I mean, so in practice, there really is a large amount of overlap. And so this normative model that many officers are inculcated in really ends up being a fantasy land. Now, Huntington and another scholar, Janowitz, lay out this other model called subjective control of the military, which accepting the fact that much of the interaction is actually at a nexus where we share responsibilities, civilian and military, that the best way to ensure civilian control is to penetrate the military institutions and essentially have it reflect the administration. That's problematic in a number of areas. Number one is, of course, the Constitution provides for divided control of the military, and yet we're going to look to an administration. How's that going to play out? Well, we can see that's going to be fraught for politics. And then also experience has shown us that where officers are essentially conducting their behavior in accordance with objective control and administrations using subjective control, and that played a major role into the challenges, the failures of Vietnam, and even the early days of 2003 and the war in Iraq. So, I mean, when you look at fissures, that's part of the problem we're dealing with right now, is at the highest level of the civil-military nexus, we don't really have an effective construct. As you mentioned, I've written about this. I actually offer Madisonian control, and it's really about reimagining relationships. It is absolutely grounded in the Constitution. It acknowledges, of course, civilian control of the military, the elected leaders, the President of the United States, and the members of the Congress as the principles for civilian control. Where the reimagining comes in has to do with top-level officers and the political appointees. What has come down to us over time is that these political appointees are essentially tantamount to being elected officials. And so that their fealty to the political appointees is made equal to the elected leaders. The challenge with that is that then our elected leaders don't always get the information, analysis, and advice they need from the military, this best military judgment by law required of the chairman. So I've argued in Madisonian control, what we really need is Madisonian concepts, which is that the agents, if you will, principal agent, that the political appointees and the military, essentially iron sharpens iron. They're actually having competitive information analysis and advice so that they can provide the elected leaders the kind of insights that they need to make weighty decisions. And so, that's one major fissure. And then the other one I tell you is we have issues at the low and mid grades of partisan behavior. So it's just not constructive. It's not helpful. It doesn't put the military in best light. And it's attendant to the social media developments that you point out. I mean, I've seen on Twitter, folks who are clearly officers, even at the ranks of battalion commander, and yet they'll have hashtag resistance or hashtag persistence. And when you're commanding troops, he or she commanding hundreds, maybe thousands of troops, and they're aware of your social media presence, now you're starting to wonder, is this what right looks like? So, that's what I would tell you. Those are two of the major issues that I see for civil-military relations today, and it's made our relations dysfunctional.
So let's pick up on the latter fissure. You're absolutely right that professional norms are something that we rely on heavily at West Point, in particular, to help cadets and future officers navigate what is now a hyper-politicized environment. And so one example of how the norms of nonpartisanship for active military officers may be unclear is the recent controversy around Major General Patrick Donahue, the former commander of the Maneuver Center of Excellence. So as you know, he posted a defense of women in the military on his social media account, which led to an investigation and eventually the Army releasing new social media guidance to the force, which will restrict individuals from disseminating official Army policy from personal social media accounts. Can you talk a little bit about the relevant norms at play in this situation and how a student of civil military relations should think about this case?
Well, prior to this new change in policy, it was essentially the Wild West. You'll find some officers who are entrepreneurial. They're out there on social media. They're really raising their platform. They're speaking out. And as we've all seen, the best way to gain followers is to be really pungent. I mean, to really stand out, say something that's dramatic or say something that's in such a way that's perceived as caustic. So, and that's not to say that General Donahue performed in that way, but I am saying that that is what we're seeing prior to the new announcement. As it relates to what General Donahue did, now talking specifically about that circumstance, I certainly understand the sentiment of what he was trying to do, but I think we saw what happened. Engagement in such a way with Tucker Carlson, somebody who has tens of millions of followers, and really some of those followers, many of those followers are families from which our enlistees come from. And for the way this played out, it really didn't put the military in the best light. Although, again, the sentiment of standing up for women is completely necessary, frankly. But what I would suggest here is that what is needed, rather than having 300 to 400 general officers all in this space, and really competing for seeing who's got the most resonating way to say and take on Tucker Carlson, a more functional way to have addressed the matter would be from the leadership. It's a lot to put in their rucksack, but the Secretary of the Army and also the Chief of Staff of the Army, for them to come out with a clarifying statement. I mean, frankly, the current array of our ranks is in law. So it's coming from the principals. These are elected leaders to our country, and the military is honoring and being loyal to what the law is. So as a matter of preference, the military, of course, privately, I'm sure has preference, but really is clinically is just loyal followers of what the principals have put in law. And as it relates to what it means now for modern day military is we need every soldier, serving to their potential. It's just not acceptable that any soldier would not be serving to their potential. So you can understand the sentiment of standing up for women in the military because they're essential to the overall effectiveness. But again, that is best communicated by the leadership of the Army because they can speak for the Army. Whereas a one-star general or a two-star general, they're making an editorial comment. And then in that interplay with Tucker Carlson, it looks as if this person is speaking for the military. So it is more of a challenge for our leadership, but I think this is part of this reality of the social media construct. I think the policy will be helpful, although more is going to be needed. There are going to be moments like this in the future. And, what we saw what the Army leadership did, they not only came forward with the policy, but then eventually they came forward with clarifying language, affirming the need for every soldier, and in this case, female soldiers, to know that they are seen, affirmed, and needed for the ranks for our effectiveness. But in the future, I think we're going to need to have statements shortly thereafter when this happens. And, maybe the best way to do this is in circumstances like that, is for the Army leadership to ask to go on the show and really just explain the fact that this is in law and we're complying with law and we're doing the very best we can, the Army now speaking, doing the very best they can to uphold not only the values of the military that come from the Uniform Code of Military Justice provided by the elected leaders, but also the bottom line, which is the effectiveness of the military.
And that would be consistent with the way that senior military officers have communicated over other mediums in the past. It's just this new way people communicate today is difficult for some to navigate. Now, I would like to pivot to how the bright lines of nonpartisanship are different potentially for retired senior military officials. And it was General Omar Bradley who said, "I'm convinced that the best service a retired general can perform is to turn in his tongue along with his suit and to mothball his opinions." And you'll, of course, find variations on that theme among the retired general officer cohort, as well as those who disagree with General Bradley. But just recently, several retired chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 6 former superintendents of the service academies, and over a dozen retired 4-star general officers signed an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in the affirmative action case, Students for Fair Admissions versus the President and Fellows of Harvard College and the University of North Carolina. And just briefly, their argument is that affirmative action in college admissions is actually a national security imperative, as the majority of the officer corps every year draws from ROTC programs. If the court were to invalidate race-based admissions policies, the brief argues that the military's efforts to source a highly qualified, racially diverse officer corps would be seriously damaged. And so there's a lot to unpack there, but in the context of our conversation, I'm curious whether you think this is appropriate political behavior on the part of the signatories or not.
Colonel Demarest, first of all, I'm going to have a hot take on this. But, that probably doesn't surprise you, knowing that I've offered the Madisonian construct for civil-military relations rather than the objective or subjective control. But I hope that you'll see that at least my views are consistent. They're internally consistent. Look, when Madison was asked about factions, one of the options was, well, maybe we'll outlaw them. And, Madison said the cure would be worse than the disease. I understand when I hear from retired four-stars and they say that, as you mentioned, Bradley, and even some contemporary four-stars have said same, but it's just not realistic. These retired officers are by definition without authority. So even though you could argue they have referent power because of the previous authority, but they don't speak for the military, they are retired. And as such, they're citizens who have the same First Amendment rights as anybody else. And so with some limitations, there are some stipulations in Uniform Code of Military Justice, even for retirees, but on matters such as you raise in this case, there is nothing against law. What you are invoking is the possibility of norms. And I'd suggest to you that you can't solve it. The way to address it, though, is the way Madison did. The way Madison did, he said, let's extend the sphere so that ambition can counteract ambition. And in the similar vein, the best way to address the perceived political behavior of retired officers is to allow for a market. Because, for everybody on the right, you're going to find a retired general on the left, and there'll be enough out there, a cacophony, that you'll end up having less of an impact on this matter for civil-military relations. Now, once again, this does make the rucksack heavier for the current leadership. So for the Secretary of the Army, Ms. Wormuth, and for also General McConville, this makes their job harder because then folks will look to the Army and say, well, what's your position on this? So I want to be clear, when these leaders are brought before Congress and asked these questions, it is their oath to answer them. Actually, as part of their confirmation process, they actually consent to this. Among the last questions that are asked before votes are taken on record to confirm is they say, will you pledge to come back to the Congress and when asked, give us your best military advice, information, analysis, and advice? And they all affirm. And that's part of the record when they get confirmed. So on the matter of this pending court case, they may very well be asked. And so when asked for them to provide information that's related to, in their view, that is judgment, in their view, impacting on the effectiveness of the military, given the realities of an all-volunteer force and who comes forward and how that is demographically arrayed, the need to have leadership that looks like the force is an imperative for the effectiveness, for the legitimacy and the effectiveness of the force. That's presuming that the Secretary of the Army and the Chief of Staff of the Army concur with that. But that's when it would be appropriate, is before a congressional hearing. As far as retired officers signing on to amicus briefs, I think that you really can't stop that. And I don't think it's actually productive to try, because I think what you'll end up doing is you'll stifle some voices and not stifle others. And you could give an inaccurate perception of where retired officers are. Better to let the market sort through that. And that's a hot take, by the way. That's not what you're going to hear from me. A lot of experts in civil-military relations, oh, no, they shouldn't speak. And I don't know how you make that happen. Really, how do you make that happen? I don't think you can.
Do you think that there are certain areas or topics that the retired General Officer Corps might want to embrace a norm of not participating in, current conflict?
Well, look, it is pushing the envelope. We're seeing it, right? You're seeing general officers show up at political conventions. Yeah, that's taken on, that's a whole different level than maybe just writing an op-ed piece and stating your piece on or on your opinion on something. It does escalate. And the reason why is it's clear that the political operatives are trying to give the perception that the uniformed military is lining up behind that. So like anything else, it's like that old saying, your parents taught you, you have the right to say anything. It doesn't mean you should, right? So look, they wouldn't have risen to 4 stars if they didn't have a certain moxie and judgment. So the expectation is that they'll still show reasonability when it comes to what they do and what they say. But on the matter of them speaking out on a amicus brief, something that they view in relation to national security, I really don't think you can govern that, even with norms. But that doesn't mean that every retired officer needs to think through what it is they're going to do in relation to how that could impact American politics, frankly.
Well, let's take it from four-star generals back down to cadets. So nonpartisanship obviously is something that is taught and reinforced all throughout a cadet's 47-month experience. And cadets know almost instinctively when they get here that that's the right answer and the norm that they ought to follow. But it's often difficult for them to grasp the perspective of why it matters before they've even been commissioned. And you are in a pretty unique position of having been both a senior military officer and an elected official. And what would your answer be then to a cadet in a classroom who wants to understand what is actually at risk here when active duty officers act in an inappropriate partisan manner?
The essence of this is that the military is an institution that supports a democratic republic. So the way that we work here is we take elections, we count votes, and then we empower for a period of time until the next election. And that is the expectation as to, given whatever job they have. If they serve on the Armed Services Committee or they serve as the President of the United States, they get authorities attendant to the Constitution. When the military acts in a partisan manner, it really then erodes trust. The military is expected to execute, as long as they're legal, orders of the duly elected officials. So when partisan behavior is performed, it actually calls into question just how the fealty of how well they'll execute, and also perhaps even perceive more nefariously that they'll try to undermine what the orders are. So it's not in the interest of the military to ever exhibit anything partisan, but to be a loyal officer of the United States. You know, lately, especially given how polarized the country is, this has upped the stakes. And I want to make a distinction here between partisan and political behavior. Partisan behavior is language and activities that directly line up with the stated positions of parties who are vying for power in the United States and who, after elections, get authority and power and then execute that authority and power. That's partisan behavior. Political behavior, so, just providing information, analysis, and advice on whether or not to go to war, on the costs of any military operation, what the size of the force will be, what the personnel policies, that is inherently going to be political. But officers are expected to provide information and analysis and advice. And under law, the top military officer is expected to do that. So I don't think, just as I mentioned to you, that with retired officers, you can't regulate their behavior. You have to let the market do that. I think there's also an understanding that for officers, they're going to be, from the moment that they're interacting in the nexus, the civil military nexus, anyone can claim at any moment they're acting political. But the question is, are they acting partisan? Are they putting their thumb on the scale of this contestation that's going on that ultimately the American people get to decide through an election? It is embracing nonpartisan and avoiding partisan behavior.
So have you seen that done particularly well, or have you seen a military officer overstepping their bounds of best military advice in the political environment, bleeding into partisanship?
Well, let me give you an example, one that really happened. Actually, somebody who I looked up to, he's in heaven now, I believe, and that's General Colin Powell, who I would say, by and large, is a good role model. Now, of course, that's a hot take because some of the scholars think he was not. I will point out, in their defense, and contra to my overall analysis, is he posted an op-ed piece in the New York Times in October of 1992, where General Powell said that more than any other recent president, President George H.W. Bush understands the proper use of force. You can't do that 3 weeks before a presidential. It looked tantamount to an endorsement. And so that was inappropriate. It has the clear perception of being a partisan endorsement. So that's an example of something that happened in history that is really regrettable and must be avoided. Now, in the current context, I would just caution any senior leader, well, first of all, to know, this is going to seem a little bit ironical, but when you talk about expert knowledge, Huntington talked about expert knowledge, even as he propounded the objective control model. And what I would say is that expert knowledge today really requires senior leaders to know politics. They need to know politics because, an analogy like a minefield. You need to know what a minefield looks like because you don't want to step on mines. So I think when you know politics, then you know that in the culture war that the country is going through right now, there are certain phraseologies. There are certain words that connote that one is a culture warrior and has a side. You're a partisan in the culture war. So I would say that senior officers, when they engage in that language, they do so at risk to the institution because they may give the appearance that they're a culture warrior. If a senior leader is commenting on the military operation that's near the border, there are ways that you can appropriately address that with regard to information and analysis and advice. But if you're a senior leader and you say something like the wall is stupid, you're going to give the perception that you're a culture warrior. That's probably not what you want to, you may be able to say, look, in modern military context, we have things of obstacles. Obstacles can be natural or man-made. There are ways of describing your information analysis advice that is clinically professional, that is very military without engaging in language that appears to be one of a culture warrior. So, for example, standing up for having every American have opportunities here and rise to their God-given potential is not only in the military's interest, but it's a value that we all embrace from the Declaration of Independence on down. But saying something like white rage, even if it has the best intention, gives the appearance that one is a culture warrior. So that's, again, why having knowledge can allow you to use words that are more neutral, really not meant to be appearing to take a side in the culture war. And that's what I would urge senior leaders to do, is be knowledgeable and then not give the appearance of being involved in the culture war. And I don't think that the person who did that, I don't think this officer meant to have the appearance of a culture war, but I'm giving you a modern day application of one, along with the one I gave with General Powell, something that happened in 1992.
Well, I appreciate that ringing endorsement of the core liberal arts curriculum at West Point, and in particular, the required course in American politics that explores these themes with cadets. My last question for you is what we should watch for. Are there leading indicators that the military profession's nonpartisan norms are fraying at the edges, or evidence that these norms are healthy and strong? And is there anything more that you think that we can do at West Point to secure the future of the officer corps with regard to norms of the profession?
Well, first, I just want to really concur with your comment. I'm an ROTC grad myself, but I had the privilege of teaching at the United States Military Academy at West Point, Department of Social Sciences, and forevermore, a huge fan of West Point for everything that it does for the officer corps, the Army, but also for the nation as a bedrock of values. I think what West Point does for officership is a model for the world. And so I just want to completely associate myself with those remarks. As far as what to look for, look, I'm going to start with one that I think is really important to the military. And there are many reasons for this, but it has to do with the viability of the all-volunteer force. And look, again, there are many reasons why right at this moment we're having challenges with recruiting. The state of the economy at 3.7% unemployment, just how many young folks today can actually be eligible to serve. I get all this. I certainly do. But if we're having challenges in recruiting, we also need to look and see how well we are positioning the military to attract recruits from any corner of America. The reality is the military cannot stop the culture war that's going on. It has to coexist with it and still carry on and complete its mission. So the military should be able to attract recruits from the Deep South and from San Francisco and from New York City and from any point. There shouldn't be a single location in America that the military can't recruit. So I think the military just needs to take a hard look at how we're doing. I mean, we just Army missed by 25%, and then ask ourselves, where was that? And we also, that is to say, geographic locations. Was there anything significant from the statistical analysis that would point to some kind of challenge here as far as some changes are concerned? And if so, what can be done to reach out to make sure that no stone goes unturned to go look for people who would come and be part of the all-volunteer force. And then, other things is just take a look at what politicians are doing. If politicians are constantly using military examples, and you can't stop that. Again, it's one of these things that you can't stop, but can you minimize the impact? Can you minimize the risk? So, the inculcation for the officer corps is don't let yourself be used by anybody. I mean, the honor of being an officer is that you serve the country. To what extent can you shape your language and your actions such that you don't appear in a commercial or, being used by the bitter partisans today that are trying to give the impression to potential voters that the United States military lines up behind candidate A, candidate B, or party A or party B. So, that's one thing that has to be watched. Part of it is the social media, right? Because people can screenshot certain things and then they can actually say, look, even the military agrees with this. And then you find yourself in a situation where the officer's saying, no, I had no intention of being partisan at all. And yet that's the effect of what's happening. I'm a realist. I don't think you can take that to zero. You can try to minimize that impact, and we should watch for that. That's another thing that we should watch for. So those are two variables I'd say to be looking for.
Terrific. That is great advice. President Gibson, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for running the whole gamut of issues from the founding all the way to Instagram, and for being a friend and role model, and for your example and thinking very deeply about these issues. I appreciate it very much.
Well, I thank you for this opportunity, and I just also want to thank everyone out there who raised their right hand, who at a very young age had the maturity to apply and go to West Point and not only survive and flourish, to graduate and commission and serve. Deeply appreciate that service to the nation. It absolutely makes us a stronger and better nation. And I wish everyone well. And go Army, beat Navy.
Thank you for listening to the WPAOG Broadcast Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show, and join us each week for a new episode. Thank you for listening.